The year 1883 marked one of history's most chilling wilderness disappearances, when 27 trappers ventured into the depths of an unforgiving forest. Only 9 men emerged, their eyes haunted by secrets they could barely speak of. The vanished hunting camp's mystery has remained buried in time, until now. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The wooden boardwalks of Mill Creek creaked under the weight of anticipation as Jeremiah Holcomb stood outside the general store, his weathered face set with determination. The December air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke across the frontier town, where fur traders haggled over prices and prospectors shared whispered rumors of untapped riches in the mountains. Mill Creek was alive with possibility, its muddy main street bustling with horses and wagons despite the early winter chill. "We leave at first light," Jeremiah announced to the gathered men, his voice carrying the authority that had made him a legend among trappers throughout Montana Territory. The expedition leader ran a calloused hand over his beard, surveying the 26 faces before him. Men he had personally selected for their skill, endurance, and willingness to follow orders without question. Augustus Reed, a quiet man with observant eyes, nodded solemnly as he checked his rifle for the 3rd time that morning. Beside him, Paul Mitchell laughed nervously, still green despite his eagerness. The veteran trappers from Missouri stood apart, their faces tanned and lined from years in the wilderness, while the younger recruits from Ohio and Pennsylvania whispered excitedly about the fortunes awaiting them in the Bitterroot Range. "Each man carries his weight," Holcomb continued, gesturing to the impressive mountain of supplies stacked against the storefront. 200 pounds of flour, 50 of coffee, ammunition enough to last the winter. His ledger contained every detail, each penny spent, each item purchased with dollars saved and borrowed. The pragmatic leader had planned for every contingency, except the one that would ultimately consume them. Richard Roberts, broad-shouldered and confident, helped distribute the steel traps among the pack mules. "These beauties will bring us beaver pelts worth their weight in gold," he boasted, demonstrating the mechanism to some of the less experienced men. The animals shifted nervously under their growing burdens, as if sensing the journey ahead would be unlike any other. Inside the store, locals watched the preparations with a mixture of admiration and envy. The winter trapping season promised wealth for those brave enough to venture into the mountains, and Holcomb's reputation suggested this expedition would return richer than most. "The Bitterroot is unforgiving," an old-timer warned from his chair by the pot-bellied stove, "especially along Blackwater Creek." His words drew a few concerned glances, but the excitement of the moment quickly washed them away. As dusk approached, the trappers gathered at the town's only saloon for a final night of comfort. Drinks flowed freely as they toasted to success, unaware that for 18 of them, these were the last moments of normal life they would ever know. Jeremiah watched his men celebrate, his calculated gaze missing nothing as he committed each face to memory, faces that would haunt him in the months to come. The 27 men departed Mill Creek at dawn, their breath crystallizing in the frigid air as they guided their convoy of pack mules along the frozen banks of Blackwater Creek. Jeremiah Holcomb led from the front, his weathered face set with determination as he navigated the increasingly narrow path into the Bitterroot Wilderness. Behind him stretched a line of men and animals, laden with supplies purchased from the general store, sacks of flour and coffee beans, ammunition, and hundreds of steel traps that clinked softly with each step. The journey grew more arduous as they ventured deeper. Towering pines closed around them, their branches heavy with snow, while the Bitterroot Range dominated the horizon, massive peaks crowned with ice that caught the winter sun and gleamed like polished silver. Blue shadows stretched across the valley floor, creating pools of intense cold that the trappers hurried through, urging their mules forward. "Keep moving," Holcomb called back to the line. We'll make camp before nightfall." By the 9th day, they had reached their destination, a sheltered clearing where Blackwater Creek widened slightly before continuing its journey through the mountains. Augustus Reed surveyed the site with approval, noting the abundance of pine for building and the proximity to water. The men wasted no time. Axes rang out from dawn till dusk as they felled trees and shaped logs. Within 2 weeks, a proper settlement had emerged from the wilderness. 5 sturdy cabins arranged in a semicircle, 2 smokehouses for curing meat and pelts, and a central mess hall where the men could gather for meals and warmth. Richard Roberts, despite his headstrong nature, proved himself an excellent builder, directing the construction of the smokehouses with practiced efficiency. "Finest camp I've built in 15 seasons," Holcomb remarked one evening, making careful notations in his leather-bound ledger. The expedition leader tracked everything: pounds of coffee consumed, ammunition expended, and most importantly, the growing collection of pelts secured in the storage cabin. The men worked in organized shifts, some heading out before first light to check and reset trap lines along the creek's icy banks, others venturing deeper into the timber, where fox and marten tracks promised rich rewards. Paul Mitchell, still young and eager to prove himself, consistently returned with the heaviest haul, earning grudging respect from the veterans. The cold was relentless, seeping through layers of wool and leather, numbing fingers and toes. At night, temperatures plummeted so low that trees cracked like gunshots in the darkness. Yet inside their cabins, warmed by crackling fires and the promise of profit, the trappers maintained their spirits. They played cards by lantern light, told tall tales, and dreamed of the money that would be theirs come spring. None suspected that for 18 of them, this forest would become their eternal home. The morning before departure, 3 Salish elders appeared at the edge of Mill Creek's muddy thoroughfare. Their weathered faces and solemn demeanor drew curious glances from the trappers, loading supplies onto their pack mules. Jeremiah Holcomb was counting sacks of flour when Augustus Reed nudged him, pointing toward the Native Americans who stood waiting patiently. "What do they want?" Holcomb muttered, reluctantly setting down his ledger and approaching the visitors. The eldest of the 3 spoke in halting English, his eyes never leaving Holcomb's face. He spoke of Blackwater Creek, a place the Salish people avoided. The elder described strange echoes that carried human voices where no people walked, and how hunters who ventured too deep into certain valleys never returned. His companions nodded gravely, adding details about peculiar markings on trees and the unnatural silence that fell in those woods even during summer. "The land remembers," the elder concluded, making a gesture with his hands that seemed both blessing and warning. "It keeps what it takes." Holcomb listened with thinning patience, his pragmatic mind already dismissing these warnings as primitive superstition. When they finished, he thanked them curtly and promised to keep an eye out, his tone making it clear he considered the matter closed. As the elders departed, Paul Mitchell approached Holcomb. "My grandfather trapped with Salish guides," he said quietly. "They don't speak of such things lightly." "Superstitious nonsense," the expedition leader replied, returning to his inventory. "Every inch of these mountains has some ghost story attached to it. We'd never set a single trap if we listened to them all." Yet not all the men shared their leader's dismissive attitude. That evening, Richard Roberts and 5 others huddled near the general store, discussing what they'd heard. "My cousin worked with the Salish," one trapper whispered. "Says they know these mountains better than any white man." Augustus Reed felt an involuntary chill despite the mild evening. "Perhaps we should ask for more details?" Robert shook his head. "Holcomb's made up his mind. Besides, the best pelts are always where others fear to tread." This sentiment eventually prevailed among the men. The promise of untouched trapping grounds, where beaver, mink, and marten had never learned to fear steel, was too tempting. By morning, even those who had felt uneasy pushed their concerns aside, bolstered by Holcomb's confidence and the prospect of wealth. As they filed out of Mill Creek, 27 strong, several noticed the Salish elders watching silently from the hillside above town. None of the trappers acknowledged them, their eyes fixed instead on the trail ahead and the fortune that awaited in the wilderness beyond. The routine at Blackwater Creek Camp settled into a comfortable rhythm as December's harsh winds gave way to January's deep freeze. Jeremiah Holcomb rose before dawn each day, meticulously updating his leather-bound ledger by lantern light. The expedition leader's disciplined approach transformed what could have been chaos into a well-oiled operation that yielded impressive results. "Best haul I've seen in 15 years, Holcomb announced one evening, tallying the day's catch. The men gathered around the mess hall's crackling fire, their faces glowing with pride as they examined the growing collection of beaver, mink, and fox pelts hanging from the rafters. Augustus Reed, whose keen eye had already earned him respect among the veterans, developed a particularly effective trapping technique along the creek's northern bend. "The way Reed sets those steel traps," one man commented, "it's like the animals line up to meet them." The observant trapper merely smiled, enjoying the camaraderie that had developed among these once strangers. Each morning, teams departed in different directions, firearms loaded and traps in tow. By midday, they'd return with their catches, the afternoon devoted to skinning and preserving. Paul Mitchell proved especially skilled at preparing the pelts, his nimble fingers working the knife with surgeon-like precision. The cabin he shared with 3 others became the unofficial processing center, the scent of pine tar and stretched fur permeating everything. Evenings brought welcome respite from the biting cold. Richard Roberts, despite his stubborn nature, entertained the men with tall tales from Missouri, while cards exchanged hands over coffee laced with whiskey. Laughter bounced off the log walls as bets were placed using pebbles instead of dollars. Holcomb had insisted all actual currency remain locked in his trunk until their return to Mill Creek. "Order is what separates men from beasts," the leader often reminded them, supervising the inventory of supplies each Sunday without fail. Every ounce of flour, coffee, and ammunition was accounted for, ensuring they'd face no shortages before spring. The men grew to trust Holcomb's methods completely. When blizzards howled through the Bitterroot Range, trapping them indoors for 3 straight days, his calm demeanor and unwavering routine kept panic at bay. The expedition leader had transformed 27 individual trappers into a cohesive unit that functioned like clockwork. By mid-January, their success seemed assured. The value of their accumulated pelts would fetch enough in Mill Creek to make even the greenest among them a small fortune. None suspected that the forests surrounding their thriving camp harbored secrets darker than the moonless Montana nights, or that their orderly world would soon unravel, one man at a time. The morning of January 21st broke with an unusual stillness over the camp. The men had settled into their routines, checking trap lines and smoking the previous day's catch. Augustus Reed had ventured farther than most, following a promising set of tracks up the northern ridge of Blackwater Creek. When Augustus stumbled back into camp just after midday, the other trappers immediately noticed something was wrong. His face was ashen, his hands trembling as he clutched his rifle. Jeremiah Holcomb emerged from the main cabin, ledger still in hand, and approached his shaken companion. "There's something out there," Augustus whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Markings on the pines, not Salish, not anything I've ever seen before." The experienced trapper described symbols carved deep into a grove of ancient pines, intricate spirals and angular lines that seemed to pulse with an inner light when touched. More disturbing still, he had discovered the remnants of another camp nestled in a small clearing, blackened stones arranged in patterns, rotted timber that suggested cabins far older than any American settlement should be. "I heard my name," Augustus continued, his eyes darting nervously toward the tree line. clear as day, like someone was standing right behind me. "Augustus," it said, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Jeremiah dismissed the claims with practiced authority. "You've been working double shifts, Reed. Exhaustion plays tricks on a man's mind." He ordered the trapper to rest, making a note in his ledger about possible altitude sickness affecting the men. But 3 days later, Paul Mitchell returned from his morning rounds with similar tales. He'd heard whispers coming from a thicket where no person stood. The following evening, 2 Missouri veterans swore they heard their names called from the darkness beyond the firelight. "It's just the wind in the pines," Jeremiah insisted during supper, though his knuckles whitened around his tin cup. Mountain air carries sound strangely. The men nodded, wanting to believe their leader, but their eyes betrayed their growing unease. They began checking their traps in pairs rather than alone. Conversations around the evening fire grew hushed, punctuated by long silences as the trappers strained to listen to the forest beyond their camp. Richard Roberts, always quick to challenge authority, cornered Jeremiah outside the mess hall. "The men are spooked," he said bluntly. "Maybe those Salish warnings weren't just superstition." Jeremiah's face hardened. "We have a job to do," he replied. But that night, the expedition leader added a new column to his meticulous records, one labeled simply Incidents. The first entry read, "Read, markings, voices, investigate further." The last days of January brought a bitter cold that seemed to seep into the men's bones. Samuel Jenkins and Thomas Cooper, 2 experienced trappers from Missouri, volunteered to check the lines along the eastern bend of Blackwater Creek before sunrise. Jeremiah Holcomb noted their departure in his ledger, expecting their return by midday with fresh pelts. As the pale winter sun climbed higher, unease settled over the camp. The 2 men should have returned hours ago. Augustus Reed voiced his concerns during the afternoon meal, but most assumed the trappers had simply extended their route to check additional lines. By dusk, Holcomb organized a search party. He led 4 men along the creek, following the tracks Jenkins and Cooper had left in the fresh snow. The footprints were clear at first, leading precisely where the men had planned to go. Then, abruptly, they veered into a dense thicket of pine and underbrush. "They wouldn't have gone this way," Richard Roberts muttered, squinting at the darkening forest. "Not unless something drove them off course." The search party pushed forward, lanterns casting long shadows among the trees. The tracks continued for another 100 yards before they simply stopped. Not faded, not obscured by fresh snow, they simply ended, as if the men had vanished mid-stride. The searchers combed the area in widening circles, calling out names that echoed unanswered through the timber. "No blood," Reed observed, kneeling to examine the snow. "No sign of struggle at all." What they did find chilled them more than the Montana winter ever could. Near where the tracks disappeared, Holcomb discovered prints in the snow unlike any he recognized. Neither bear nor elk, nor wolf nor mountain lion. They were oddly spaced, deep at the heel, but shallow at what might have been toes, as if whatever made them barely touched the ground while moving. The expedition leader said nothing of these prints to the others. Instead, he made a careful sketch in his ledger that evening, his hand trembling slightly as he worked by lamplight. That night, the remaining men huddled closer to the fire. Conversation dwindled to whispers, then to silence. Every creak of the timber cabins, every whistle of wind through the pines seemed to carry meaning, seemed almost like voices. "The forest feels different now," Paul Mitchell said, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the camp's perimeter. "Like it's watching us." No one contradicted him. The wilderness that had previously felt like a challenge to be conquered now seemed to press against their settlement with malevolent intent. Sleep came fitfully that night, with many men starting awake at the slightest sound, convinced they'd heard their names called from the darkness. Paul Mitchell burst through the cabin door just after dusk, collapsing onto the rough-hewn floor. His face was ashen, drained of all color except for the wild terror in his eyes. Jeremiah Holcomb rushed to his side, followed by Augustus Reed and 2 other trappers who had been playing cards by the fire. "Mitchell, what happened?" Holcomb demanded, his authoritative voice betraying a hint of concern as he helped the trembling man to a bench. Paul's lips quivered, his words coming in disjointed fragments between desperate gulps of air. "Found a cave 3 miles north, following beaver tracks." His fingers clutched at Holcomb's sleeve with surprising strength. "There's something inside, something that shouldn't be there." Reed offered a tin cup of whiskey, which the terrified trapper drained in one swallow. The amber liquid seemed to steady him momentarily. "It was a door," Paul continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that forced the men to lean closer. "But not made of wood or metal. It shimmered, like water standing on its end. I could see through it, but not clearly." The other men exchanged uneasy glances. The expedition leader frowned, his weathered face creasing with skepticism. "You're exhausted, Mitchell. The cold and isolation." "I know what I saw," Paul shouted, suddenly animated. There were voices coming from it, calling names, our names. His eyes darted around the room, and figures moving on the other side. Holcomb ordered the shaking man to rest, helping him to a cot in the corner of the mess hall. Throughout the night, Paul tossed in feverish sleep, muttering about the wrong side of the door and faces that aren't faces. The other trappers kept their distance, but Reed stayed nearby, dabbing the delirious man's forehead with a damp cloth. By first light, the cot was empty. Paul Mitchell had somehow slipped out unnoticed despite the men sleeping nearby. Richard Roberts organized an immediate search party, but the heavy snowfall had obscured any tracks. It wasn't until 3 days later that they found him, or what remained of him. His body lay half submerged in Blackwater Creek, frozen solid in the February cold. What disturbed the men most wasn't the death itself, but the position of the corpse. Paul's limbs were contorted at impossible angles, his face locked in an expression of such profound horror that even Holcomb, who had seen men die in countless ways on the frontier, turned away. That night, the expedition leader made a brief, cryptic entry in his ledger. "Mitchell found. Position suggests he was running from something. No tracks but his own. No one ventured north toward the cave. No one even suggested it. Fear had taken root in the camp like a parasitic vine, strangling the last remnants of courage. No one slept alone anymore. The 20 remaining trappers had abandoned their individual cabins, dragging bedrolls and personal effects into the cramped mess hall where they now spent their nights huddled together. Their rifles lay within arm's reach, loaded and ready. Augustus Reed sat closest to the fire, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing flames. He hadn't spoken much since his discovery of those strange markings in the forest. The others gave him space, recognizing the haunted look in his eyes. "I saw Thomas last night," whispered one of the younger trappers from Ohio, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Standing between those 2 tall pines, just watching." Jeremiah Holcomb looked up sharply from his ledger. The expedition leader had been meticulously documenting their dwindling supplies, trying to maintain some semblance of order as chaos crept closer. "Thomas is gone," Holcomb stated firmly. "Whatever you saw wasn't him." But the damage was done. Murmurs spread through the gathered men like wildfire. Others began to share their own sightings. Familiar faces glimpsed at the edge of the tree line, moving with strange, disjointed movements, as if their joints worked differently now. "They don't walk right," Paul Mitchell observed, his fingers nervously twisting a piece of rope, "like they're learning how to use their bodies." The trapper had grown increasingly agitated since his return from checking traps along the eastern ridge. That night, as the temperature dropped to bone-chilling levels, the men took turns keeping watch. 4 hours past midnight, Reed nudged Richard Roberts awake for his shift. The stubborn trapper had barely settled by the window when he stiffened. "Holcomb," he called softly, his breath fogging the glass, "you need to see this." Outside, Illuminated by the pale moonlight reflecting off the snow, stood three figures at the edge of the clearing. Though their features were obscured by shadow, their silhouettes were unmistakable. Men who had vanished days earlier. "They're waiting for something," whispered Reed, who had joined them at the window. As if hearing his words, one of the figures tilted its head at an impossible angle, neck bent nearly 90 degrees. It raised an arm in a jerky, mechanical gesture that might have been a wave or a beckoning. No one slept after that. The men sat in silence, firelight flickering across their wide, terrified eyes as they watched the woods. By morning, the figures had vanished, but the dread remained, settling deep in their bones like the Montana cold. "We should leave," Mitchell suggested, his voice cracking. "And go where?" Holcomb responded, his legendary confidence finally showing cracks. "Whatever's out there is between us and Mill Creek." Richard Roberts paced the mess hall, his jaw set with determination. The 30-year-old trapper had spent 3 seasons in these mountains and wasn't about to abandon his companions to whatever lurked in the wilderness. "I heard them," he insisted, slamming his fist on the rough-hewn table. "Clear as day, calling for help from the North Ridge." Jeremiah Holcomb stood opposite him, the firelight deepening the lines on his weathered face. "Nobody leaves camp. That's an order." The expedition leader's voice carried the weight of authority that had guided them through countless challenges. But for the first time, the men exchanged uncertain glances. The disappearances had shaken their faith. "With respect," Richard countered, "those are our friends out there. If they're alive, they're not." Holcomb cut him off sharply. "Whatever you heard wasn't them." 5 other trappers rose to stand beside Roberts. Augustus Reed watched silently from the corner, noting how quickly loyalties had shifted under the pressure of fear. As darkness fell, Roberts and his followers gathered their equipment. Each man checked his rifle and secured extra ammunition. They filled their canteens and packed enough provisions for a day's journey. "We'll follow the North Creek," Roberts whispered to his companions. "If we're not back by tomorrow's sunset, don't come looking." They slipped away while Holcomb was checking the perimeter, disappearing into the timber like ghosts. The soft crunch of their boots on snow faded quickly, swallowed by the vast silence of the forest. Back at camp, tension thickened the air. Men huddled closer to the fire, jumping at every snap of burning wood. Holcomb said nothing about the deserters, but his eyes constantly scanned the tree line, his hand never far from his firearm. "They shouldn't have gone," Augustus muttered to the man beside him. "The forest, it's changing." Hours passed with no sign of Roberts or his search party. The night grew deeper, colder, more absolute in its darkness. Then, just after midnight, one of the remaining trappers spotted movement at the edge of their lantern light. "There!" he hissed, pointing toward the pines. Every man turned to look. There, standing perfectly still among the trees, were shapes. Human shapes. They stood at irregular intervals, just visible enough to be recognized. "It's Roberts," someone whispered, "and the others." But something was wrong. The figures didn't move forward. They didn't call out. They simply stood, watching, their faces obscured by shadow, despite the brightness of the moon overhead. Holcomb raised his lantern higher. "Roberts," he called, "report." The figures remained motionless. One of the trappers took a step toward them, but Holcomb's hand shot out, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "Stay in the light," the leader commanded, his voice barely audible. For hours, the silent watchers remained at the edge of camp, neither advancing nor retreating. By morning they had vanished, leaving no tracks in the fresh snow. Roberts and his men never returned. The cold of February bit deeper than January ever had. The trappers huddled around the central fire, their faces gaunt and weathered by more than just the Montana winter. Each morning, fewer men gathered for the meager breakfast. Each night, more empty bedrolls remained untouched. Thomas and Edgar, 2 seasoned trappers from Missouri, volunteered to refill the water barrels from Blackwater Creek. Jeremiah Holcomb watched them trudge through the snow, buckets in hand, their figures growing smaller against the white landscape. Augustus Reed stood beside the expedition leader, both men silent as they observed. "They'll be back soon," Reed whispered, more to convince himself than Holcomb. Half an hour passed. Then an hour. Holcomb finally dispatched 2 men to check on them. They returned pale-faced, clutching only empty buckets. "We found them at the creek's edge," one reported, voice trembling. Thomas was mid-sentence to Edgar, then nothing. Just footprints stopping at the water. No struggle, no blood, nothing. That night, the remaining men pressed closer together in the mess hall. No one slept alone anymore. The forest seemed to press against the windows, its darkness absolute beyond the flickering lantern light. Some men claimed they could taste metal on their tongues, fear made tangible. "It's taking us one by one," a young trapper from Ohio muttered, his fingers nervously working the beads of a rosary. "Whatever's out there is patient. It's waiting." Holcomb maintained his stoic demeanor, but Reed noticed how the leader's hand trembled slightly when writing in his ledger. The disciplined routine that had once defined their expedition had crumbled. Trap lines went unchecked, pelts remained untanned. The promise of profit that had driven 27 men into these mountains now seemed laughably insignificant. Richard Roberts, once vocal about searching for their missing companions, had grown silent after losing 5 men on his rescue mission. He spent hours staring into the fire, jumping at every creak of the cabin walls. "We need to leave," Paul Mitchell whispered one evening, his eyes wild with fear, "before it takes us all." No one disagreed. The thought of escape had replaced all other concerns. Men packed their few belongings secretly, as if planning desertion. Some slept with their boots on, ready to flee at a moment's notice. Holcomb knew their time at Blackwater Creek was ending. Whatever they had disturbed, or whatever had noticed them, was growing bolder. The disappearances were no longer happening in the deep woods, but right at the camp's edge. "We'll burn everything when we go," he announced one night, his voice flat. "Leave nothing behind." The men nodded, relief washing over their faces. None of them wanted to imagine what might happen if someone else found this place, stirring up whatever hungry darkness they had awakened in the Bitterroot Wilderness. By late February, the once thriving camp at Blackwater Creek had become a hollow shell of its former self. Only 9 men remained of the original 27, their faces gaunt with hunger and sleepless terror. The winter cold seemed to penetrate deeper than their bones. It had reached their souls. Jeremiah Holcomb sat alone in his cabin, staring at his ledger by lantern light. The meticulous records that once tracked pelts and provisions now documented disappearances. His hand trembled as he made the final entry. "Whatever dwells here must not follow us home." "We burn it all," Holcomb announced at dawn, his voice hoarse from disuse. The surviving trappers gathered in the clearing, clutching their rifles with white-knuckled grips. Augustus Reed nodded in silent agreement, his once bright eyes now sunken and wary. "The fire will cleanse what we've disturbed," Holcomb continued. "Nothing can remain." They worked methodically, emptying cabins of anything useful, piling their remaining supplies onto the few pack mules that hadn't bolted into the forest. The trappers moved like ghosts themselves, speaking little, jumping at every crack of a branch or whisper of wind. "What about the others?" asked one man, his voice barely audible. "There are no others," Holcomb replied flatly. "Not anymore." As the sun reached its peak, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their owners, they set the first cabin ablaze. The dry timber caught quickly, orange flames licking upward against the cold blue sky. One by one, they burned the structures they had built with such hope just months before. The mess hall was last. Reed hesitated at its threshold, remembering the camaraderie of those early weeks, card games, laughter, plans for spending their earnings. Now those memories felt like they belonged to different men entirely. The smoke rose thick and black above the trees. As the flames consumed their winter home, Holcomb gathered the survivors. "We don't travel together," he instructed, his authority still unquestioned despite everything. "Take different paths back to Mill Creek. Don't speak of what happened here. Not to each other, not to anyone." No one argued. The unspoken belief hung between them. Whatever had taken their companions might still be hunting, and a group would make an easier target. They separated without goodbyes, each man or pair choosing a different direction through the timber. Reed glanced back once to see Holcomb standing alone, watching the camp collapse into embers. For a moment, Reed thought he saw other figures standing among the trees behind his leader, familiar silhouettes observing with unnatural stillness. The forest seemed to inhale as they departed, drawing in the smoke and heat and fear. Blackwater Creek had claimed 18 men, and as the 9 survivors fled, each felt certain the wilderness was not yet satisfied. The journey back through the Bitterroot Range was a stark contrast to their eager trek months earlier. What had been a unified expedition now scattered like frightened deer, each survivor choosing his own path through the wilderness. They no longer traveled as a team, but as broken men fleeing the same nightmare. Augustus Reed and Thomas Miller were the first to emerge from the tree line at the edge of Mill Creek. They appeared at sunrise, their silhouettes wavering against the pink-orange sky like mirages. The townspeople barely recognized the men who had left so confidently in December. Reed's once robust frame had withered, his eyes sunken and darting at shadows. Miller refused to speak at all, communicating only through nods and trembling hands. "Don't ask about the others," Reed warned when the shopkeeper approached. The trapper clutched his rifle with white knuckles. Though the weapon was unloaded, its ammunition long spent on unseen threats. By midday, 2 more survivors stumbled into town, Frederick Jones and William Parker. They arrived separately, despite having traveled together, as if proximity to another human had become unbearable. Both men made straight for the saloon, where they drank in silence, backs to the wall, eyes fixed on the door. When questioned about Blackwater Creek, Jones simply shook his head, while tears streamed down his weathered face. "The forest keeps what it takes," Parker finally muttered after his 4th whiskey. The barkeeper noticed how the trapper's hands trembled when shadows crossed the floor. As dusk settled over Mill Creek, Jeremiah Holcomb appeared alone on the main street. The expedition leader who had marched out with such authority now moved like a man twice his age, shoulders hunched beneath an invisible weight. His legendary ledger was clutched to his chest like a shield. The townsfolk who had gathered to welcome survivors fell silent at the sight of him. "Where are the others?" someone finally asked. Holcomb's eyes, once sharp and commanding, now seemed focused on something distant. "Gone," was all he said before continuing toward his quarters. 4 more men trickled in over the next 2 days, each as hollow-eyed and changed as those before them. The 9th and final survivor, Edward Collins, was found unconscious at the town's edge, his clothes torn and body marked with scratches that matched no known animal. The disciplined expedition that had departed with such promise now lay in psychological ruins. These 9 men shared meals and lodging in Mill Creek, but they rarely spoke to one another. Some invisible barrier had formed between them, each man carrying a piece of the horror, yet unable or unwilling to reassemble the complete picture of what had happened at Blackwater Creek. Mill Creek should have welcomed its returning sons with celebration. Instead, the town greeted the 9 survivors with uneasy whispers and sidelong glances. Jeremiah Holcomb and his men had left as conquering heroes, 27 strong, with wagons laden with supplies. Now they returned as ghosts of themselves, hollow-eyed and diminished. The general store, once bustling with trappers boasting of potential fortunes, fell silent whenever Augustus Reed or any of the others entered. Conversations died mid-sentence. The expedition leader kept to himself, renting a small room above the saloon where lamplight burned until dawn. Locals reported hearing him pacing through the night, his shadow crossing the window at odd intervals. "They ain't right," Maggie from the boarding house confided to her patrons. "That Reed fellow jumped 3 feet when I approached him from behind." And when I asked about Paul Mitchell, you remember Paul always had a kind word. Augustus just stared at me like I'd spoken in tongues. When pressed about their missing companions, the survivors offered contradictory accounts. Some claimed avalanches had taken the others. Some mentioned illness. Jeremiah insisted on unfortunate accidents with a finality that discouraged further inquiry. Yet their eyes told a different story, one of terror barely contained. The town doctor examined each man, finding them physically sound but mentally altered. "They flinch at shadows," he noted in his journal, "and they watch the tree line as if expecting visitors." Within a week, the mood in Mill Creek had soured completely. Children were called indoors before sunset. Doors previously left unlocked were now barred. The survivors themselves contributed to this atmosphere, refusing to gather in groups, avoiding one another as deliberately as they avoided questions. Augustus took to carrying his rifle even to Sunday services. Richard Roberts' cousin found him sleeping with mirrors positioned around his bed to see what comes in the night, as he explained with frightening calm. Most disturbing were the moments when the survivors would stop mid-conversation, heads tilted as if listening to distant voices only they could hear. Their eyes would track invisible movements across empty rooms. Whatever happened up in those mountains, the sheriff confided to his deputy. Those men didn't leave it behind. They brought something back with them. By month's end, Mill Creek, once the most welcoming outpost in Montana Territory, had transformed. Neighborly trust gave way to suspicion. The survivors moved through town like carriers of an invisible contagion, their silence more terrifying than any tale they might have told. The townsfolk understood instinctively that some secrets were better left buried in the wilderness, and whatever haunted the Blackwater Creek camp now haunted their streets as well. Sheriff Thomas Wilkins discovered the letter in late May, tucked inside a leather pouch among Jeremiah Holcomb's personal effects. The town council had commissioned an investigation into the Blackwater Creek incident after rumors spread of unnatural occurrences surrounding the survivors. Wilkins, a practical man who'd served Mill Creek for 15 years, found his hands trembling as he broke the wax seal. The expedition leader's normally meticulous handwriting deteriorated across the pages, growing increasingly frantic. "I write this knowing I may not survive what follows us," Holcomb had scrawled. "We brought something back, not in our packs, but in our minds. They wear the faces of the men we lost." The sheriff read on as Holcomb described how the survivors would sometimes catch glimpses of their missing companions in reflective surfaces, windows, still water, polished metal, standing just behind them, watching with empty eyes. More disturbing still, Holcomb confessed to moments when he couldn't remember hours of time, only to later hear townspeople thank him for conversations he had no memory of having. "I fear we are being replaced," the letter continued. "Whatever dwelled in that forest has followed us home. I see Reed sometimes staring at nothing, his lips moving without sound. Miller walks differently now, a slight hesitation in his step that wasn't there before. Are they still themselves? Am I?" Wilkins locked the letter in the town hall safe, sharing its contents only with Judge Harrison and Dr. Ellsworth. The 3 men agreed the document would cause panic if made public. Yet secrets rarely stay buried in small towns. The doctor's wife overheard fragments during a late-night discussion. The judge's clerk noticed the unusual security around a simple letter. Within weeks, whispers circulated through Mill Creek. Shopkeepers watched the survivors with sideways glances. Parents pulled children closer when Augustus Reed passed by on the street. The survivors themselves grew increasingly isolated, avoiding public gatherings and sometimes even daylight. Most disturbing was Holcomb's final warning. "If you notice a man casting no shadow at noon, Do not approach him. Do not speak to him. What looks back at you from behind his eyes is not human and never was. The letter itself disappeared from the safe 3 months later, vanished without evidence of theft. Sheriff Wilkins insisted it had been burned for public safety, but his nervous demeanor suggested otherwise. Some claim to have seen the document in Holcomb's possession again, though the expedition leader denied this until his death. The sealed letter became part of Mill Creek's folklore, a written testament to horrors that could never be fully articulated, confirming what many already suspected: the 9 men who walked out of the forest had not returned alone. The 9 men who staggered back to Mill Creek carried more than just their meager belongings. They bore an invisible weight that would ultimately crush most of them. Within 24 months of their return, 7 of the survivors had perished, leaving only Augustus Reed and Jeremiah Holcomb to carry the burden of what they had witnessed in the Montana wilderness. Samuel Thornton was the first to go. 3 weeks after returning, he was found hanging from the rafters of his sister's barn. The town doctor noted the peculiar absence of struggle marks and the eerily peaceful expression on his face. By summer's end, 2 more trappers had taken their own lives, one by poison, another by his hunting rifle. The others met fates that townsfolk could only describe as unnatural. Martin Doyle drowned in barely 2 feet of creek water, his body discovered face down, yet somehow positioned as if he had been standing upright. William Carson was crushed when his cabin's chimney inexplicably collapsed during a windless night. The remaining 2 died in what the local newspaper delicately termed incidents of delirium, one walking calmly into a burning building, another freezing to death on his porch during a mild autumn evening. Augustus Reed retreated to a small homestead outside town, refusing all visitors except for occasional supply deliveries. Those who glimpsed him reported a man aged beyond his years, who kept every window shuttered regardless of weather, and surrounded his property with strange symbols carved into fence posts. He never married, never traveled, and spoke to no one about what had happened at Blackwater Creek. Jeremiah Holcomb, once the commanding expedition leader whose word was law, withdrew into a rented room above the general store. The once pragmatic man became obsessed with mirrors, hanging them at precise angles throughout his quarters. Locals whispered that he would spend hours staring into them, muttering about making sure they're still mine. The former leader, who had dismissed Salish warnings, now paid handsomely for protective charms and refused to venture out after dusk. In 1921, at the age of 67, Reed died quietly in his sleep. Among his possessions was a leather-bound journal containing detailed accounts of the Blackwater incident, most pages torn out and burned. Save for the final entry, written in a shaky hand, it contained just 8 words that would become legend in Mill Creek. If a man does not cast a shadow at noon, run. Holcomb outlived Reed by 3 years, taking his own secrets to the grave. But the night watchman swore that in the hours after Holcomb's passing, he saw 9 figures standing silently outside the window, watching the old trapper's body before melting back into the darkness. By the early 1900s, the Blackwater Creek incident had faded from newspaper headlines, but its shadow stretched across generations. In Mill Creek, the descendants of Augustus Reed kept kerosene lamps burning from dusk till dawn, a tradition that puzzled neighbors but was maintained with religious dedication. Augustus himself had lived into his 70s, a recluse who jumped at shadows and muttered warnings to visitors who dared approach his homestead. "My father would wake screaming about men without shadows," explained Martha Reed, his daughter, to a local historian in 1924. "He made us check each other at noon, standing in the sun. If someone's shadow looked wrong, too faint or misshapen, we worked to speak to them." Similar stories emerged from the family of Jeremiah Holcomb. The once legendary expedition leader had survived physically but remained broken in spirit until his death in 1901. His son Jacob developed peculiar habits. He refused to enter forests, sealed every window with salt, and claimed to see his father's lost companions standing silently at the edge of their property on moonless nights. "They come wearing the same clothes they had in '83, Jacob told the town doctor. "They stand there, watching. They don't speak. They don't need to." The families of the survivors formed an unspoken brotherhood, recognizing in each other the same haunted expressions and nervous habits. They gathered on the anniversary of the return, not in celebration but in vigilance, a ritual of protection that outsiders never understood. Children born to these families inherited unexplainable fears. Many reported nightmares of being called by name from dark woods. Some developed a terror of mirrors, convinced that their reflections sometimes moved independently. Others insisted they could identify which strangers in town weren't right. People who looked normal, but whose movements seemed rehearsed, mechanical. Local physician Dr. William Thornton documented these phenomena in his private journal. The psychological impact of the Blackwater incident appears to have imprinted itself genetically. These children, born decades after the event, exhibit identical phobias and behaviors without having been told the specific details of what occurred. Most disturbing were the reports that surfaced every few years. Claims that one of the original missing trappers had been spotted in town, unchanged by time, watching the homes of survivors with patient, unblinking eyes. "The curse doesn't sleep," Martha Reed told her children. "It waits, and it remembers all our names." The years rolled on, but Blackwater Creek's reputation only grew darker. By the 1920s, the original tragedy had transformed from recent history into the stuff of campfire tales. Yet something lingered in those woods, refusing to be forgotten. Park Ranger Samuel Thornton made the first documented modern encounter in 1923. While patrolling the old trapping grounds, he spotted a man in outdated clothing standing perfectly still among the pines. The figure wore the heavy wool coat and beaver hat common to trappers of the previous century. When Thornton called out, the stranger neither moved nor responded. The ranger approached cautiously, but as he closed within 20 yards, the figure simply wasn't there anymore. "Like he dissolved into the mist," Thornton wrote in his official report, which was promptly buried by his superiors. The ranger never returned to that section of forest again. Throughout the 20s and 30s, similar accounts accumulated. A geological survey team in 1927 reported seeing multiple individuals in period dress watching them from ridgelines. When photographed, these figures appeared only as smudges or weren't captured at all. 3 members of that team abruptly resigned upon returning to civilization. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every decade, like clockwork, someone vanished near Blackwater Creek. In 1932, it was a young botanist. In 1943, a hunter. In 1956, 2 teenage campers. Search parties found the same puzzling evidence each time: tracks that stopped mid-stride, personal belongings arranged in neat piles, and sometimes crude symbols carved into nearby trees that matched descriptions from Jeremiah Holcomb's sealed letter. Local families developed their own protective rituals. Descendants of Augustus Reed refused to enter the woods after sunset. The Miller family, whose grandfather had been among the survivors, maintained the tradition of keeping kerosene lamps burning through the night on the anniversary of the original disappearances. The Forest Service eventually placed warning signs along certain trails, citing dangerous terrain rather than acknowledge the true nature of the hazard. Rangers assigned to the area requested transfers at twice the normal rate. Those who stayed developed habits that outsiders found peculiar: checking their shadows at noon, carrying salt in their pockets, never answering if they heard their name called from the trees. The forest remembers. An elderly descendant of one survivor told a journalist in 1978, "And sometimes it wants company." The reporter's recorder captured only static when played back. What walked those woods? Memory, ghost, or something that had never been human kept its vigil. The figures in outdated clothing continued to be glimpsed through the decades, always watching, always silent, always gone when approached. In the summer of 1963, Theodore Blackwood, a history professor from Seattle University, became obsessed with the Blackwater Creek mystery. His colleagues watched with growing concern as his office walls disappeared beneath maps, photographs, and yellowed newspaper clippings about the vanished trappers. What began as academic curiosity had transformed into something more consuming. "I need to walk where they walked," Theodore told his department head before taking an extended sabbatical. He packed lightly, a journal, camping equipment, and copies of Holcomb's surviving documents. The professor meticulously planned to retrace the exact route the 27 men had taken 80 years earlier. 3 weeks after entering the Bitterroot Wilderness, Theodore Blackwood vanished. Search parties combed the area, but found only his abandoned campsite near what locals still called Blackwater Creek. His journal remained open, the last entry trailing off mid-sentence. "The trees here seem to watch. I hear voices calling from the ridge, just as Reed described. Perhaps if I—" The search was eventually abandoned. Theodore's wife held a memorial service attended by somber academics who spoke of his dedication to historical truth. But on a rainy Tuesday in November, 4 months after his disappearance, a man walked into Pike Place Market in downtown Seattle. Gaunt and hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that hung from his frame, he approached a shopkeeper and identified himself as Theodore Blackwood. The shopkeeper later told reporters something felt wrong about the encounter. "He stood too still," she recalled. "And when he spoke, there were these long pauses between words, like he was trying to remember how to talk." 3 witnesses confirmed meeting the man claiming to be the professor. Each described the same unsettling behavior. He rarely blinked, maintained uncomfortable eye contact, and spoke in halting, mechanical phrases. When asked where he'd been, he simply replied, "I found what they found. I saw what they saw. I am returned." The man disappeared before Theodore's wife could be contacted. Police reports noted his appearance in 3 more locations over the next week, each time behaving more erratically. Security footage from a downtown hotel showed him standing motionless in a hallway for over 3 hours before walking away. The final confirmed sighting came from a night watchman at the university. He reported seeing Theodore standing outside his former office at 3 in the morning, staring up at the window. When approached, the figure turned and walked into the shadows, never to be seen again. To this day, Theodore Blackwood's true fate remains unknown, another name added to the long list of those who ventured too close to the mystery of Blackwater Creek and paid with more than just their lives. Over the decades, historians and paranormal investigators have proposed countless theories about what truly happened at Blackwater Creek. Some academics examining Jeremiah Holcomb's ledger entries suggest the men suffered from ergot poisoning, a fungal contamination of their flour supply that could induce hallucinations and paranoia. Others point to the isolation and harsh winter conditions as catalysts for a collective psychosis. Dr. Eleanor Winters, who studied the case extensively in the 1970s, believed the trappers may have stumbled upon an indigenous burial ground or sacred site, triggering either supernatural consequences or their own guilt-driven madness. "The Salish warnings weren't superstition," she wrote. "They were memory, knowledge of something dangerous in those woods." The sealed letter left behind by Holcomb remains the most compelling and disturbing piece of evidence. His chilling statement about bringing something back in their minds suggests an entity or consciousness that could somehow possess or replace a person. This aligns disturbingly well with Augustus Reed's later journal entries, where he described watching his fellow survivors and noting moments when they seemed not themselves. Theodore Blackwood's research, before his disappearance, pointed to geological anomalies around Blackwater Creek, unusual magnetic readings, and unexplained cold spots. His field notes, recovered from his Seattle apartment, contained sketches of symbols matching those Augustus had reported seeing carved into trees. Were these markings left by previous victims, or something older than human habitation? Some local residents of Mill Creek maintain that the forest itself was the predator. "Those mountains have always taken people," explained Martha Simmons, great-granddaughter of a Mill Creek shopkeeper who knew the survivors. "The trees remember things we've forgotten." Modern skeptics dismiss the entire affair as frontier mythology, a cautionary tale born from the dangers of wilderness life, embellished over generation. Yet they struggle to explain why forest rangers still report unusual phenomena near the old campsite, or why electronic equipment frequently malfunctions in the area. Perhaps most telling is that no official search party was ever organized for the 18 missing men. When pressed about this unusual oversight, a county official reportedly said, "Some things are better left unfound." The truth of what happened to those trappers remains as elusive as morning mist over Blackwater Creek. But one fact stands undisputed. 27 men entered the Bitterroot Range that winter, and only 9 emerged, forever changed by whatever they encountered in those silent, ancient woods. 27 men entered the Montana wilderness in the winter of 1883, their packs laden with steel traps and ambition. Only 9 returned to Mill Creek, their eyes haunted by visions they could never fully articulate. The rest vanished without trace, their fates sealed by whatever lurked among the pines of Blackwater Creek. The expedition that Jeremiah Holcomb had so meticulously planned became a cautionary tale, whispered around frontier campfires for generations. The survivors carried their burden differently. Augustus Reed lived into his 70s, though townsfolk often found him staring into the woods at dawn, rifle in hand, as if expecting visitors. He refused to sleep without a lantern burning, a habit his children and grandchildren unconsciously adopted. The sealed letter Holcomb left behind spoke of men who wore the faces of those we lost, a cryptic warning that haunted officials who discovered it. Locals avoided the Bitterroot Range near Blackwater Creek, claiming the forest itself had developed a taste for human company. Hunters reported eerie silence where birds should sing, and tracks that appeared and disappeared without logic. Some swore they glimpsed figures in outdated trapper clothing, standing motionless between distant trees. Theodore Blackwood's strange reappearance in 1968 only deepened the mystery. The researcher who vanished while investigating the incident returned changed, speaking in disjointed sentences and staring without blinking. When a Seattle shopkeeper asked about his time in Montana, Blackwood reportedly whispered, "Time moves differently there. They're still waiting." He disappeared again 3 days later. Academics have proposed rational explanations: exposure, starvation, tribal conflicts, even mass hysteria induced by toxic fungi or contaminated water. Yet none fully account for the consistent pattern of disappearances that continued into modern times, or the peculiar behaviors exhibited by survivors and their descendants. The Forest Service eventually placed Marcos near the suspected camp location, though 3 separate survey teams reported equipment malfunctions and inexplicable anxiety when approaching the site. In 1997, a ranger discovered century-old steel traps arranged in a perfect circle around a clearing where nothing grew. Those familiar with the story still heed the warning found in the last survivor's journal. If a man does not cast a shadow at noon, run. For in the deep woods of the Bitterroot Range, some say the boundary between our world and another grows thin, and those who disappeared over a century ago might still be watching from just beyond the tree line.